I saw it from the second wagon, close enough to count her breaths. She didn't cry. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it now. 4 daughters traded north over 11 years for grain treaties and grazing lines, and this one, the last one, the spare one, stood on that plateau in iron chain cuffs with her chin level and her eyes dry, and I thought, that's not courage, that's just a girl who's already used to losing. I'd seen the king's face 100 times in 100 ledgers and tribute songs, and never once heard he looked at anyone the way he looked at her. Like she'd said something. She hadn't said a word. The wind on Kelmore Plateau comes sideways, always has, scraping over 600 years of border disputes settled and unsettled, and settled again. That morning it carried wood smoke from the king's camp and wet wool from her father's, and underneath both, faint, the mineral smell of the chain at her wrists, cold iron sweating in cold air. Freya stood between 2 columns of men who'd come to watch her stop being a daughter and start being a Claus. Her father, Lord Cassian Vale, did not look at her either. He had a habit, she'd counted it since she was 9, of touching the signet ring on his left hand when he was about to say something he didn't believe. He touched it now. The Vale line offers its 4th daughter, he said, as token of peace and kinship, sealing the border of Ashvale to the crownlands of Thornhall, this and all generations following. 22 years old. 3 older sisters married off to lesser houses, for lesser reasons, a trade route, a debt forgiven, a cousin's vanity. She was the one nobody had needed yet, the one kept in reserve. And reserves, she'd learned early, get spent without ceremony. The Thornhall delegation waited in a loose crescent of black and iron gray, wolves in human shape, still in the particular way wolves are still. Not the stillness of waiting, but of already having arrived. At its center stood the king. Lucan. I'd heard he was big. Everyone says that about alpha kings. It's practically required, but this was different. He had the kind of stillness that makes a room quieter just by occupying it, shoulders like a man who'd carried things he never put down, and on his left forearm a long pale scar that didn't curve, didn't soften, a straight, clean line like something had tried to take the arm off in one motion and failed. He hadn't looked at the bride once since the parties arrived. He was watching the tree line. That should have told her something. She didn't know it yet. The chains came off her wrists when Lord Vale finished speaking, replaced by a length of gray-blue cord. Thornhall cord, the marriage-binding kind, soft enough to be a courtesy and strong enough to mean something else. A man she didn't know stepped forward to tie it around her wrist. His hands were shaking very slightly. Hers were not. That's when it happened. That's the moment I keep coming back to. The king turned his head. Not toward the cord, not toward her father, not toward the formal business of the thing. Toward her, and he looked, really looked, the way you look at a person and not a parcel. The way you look at something you intend to remember. And something crossed his face that wasn't relief, and wasn't triumph, and wasn't anything the treaty had prepared either delegation for. Lord Vale's hand went to his ring again, twice in one ceremony. I'd never seen him do that before. The wind kept moving, the cord kept tightening, and 20 feet away, the Alpha King of Thornhall looked at the 4th daughter nobody had wanted to spend and did not look away. She didn't know what it meant. Neither did I. I only knew, watching it, that something on that plateau had just gone wrong for somebody, and it wasn't her. She'd practiced for indifference, not for this. Freya had built herself for the version of the handover she expected. A king who glanced once, catalogued her, acceptable, plain enough, useful enough, and turned back to the business of borders and grain quotas and the 50 other things that mattered more than a 4th daughter's face. She'd rehearsed the posture for it on the 3-day ride north, sitting very straight in a wagon that smelled of cedar and her own fear suite, telling herself, be furniture. Furniture doesn't get hurt by being furniture. You only get hurt if you expect to be a person. He looked at her like she was a person. It lasted 4 seconds. She counted them the way she counted everything that frightened her, a habit from childhood, numbers laid over panic like a splint. 1. His eyes were not what she expected, not cold, not the flat amber of the stories, but a brown so dark it read black until the light caught it. 2. He was not posed for her benefit. Whatever this was, it wasn't performance. His jaw hadn't arranged itself into anything courtly. 3. Somewhere behind her, her father's breath changed, went short and careful, a man recalculating. 4. The king looked away first. That was the part that stayed with her longest. Not that he'd looked, that he'd been the one to stop. The cord-tying man finished his knot. Freya flexed her wrist inside it, testing the give, an old habit from chains that had less give than this. The cord smelled of cedar oil and something herbal underneath, lavender maybe, meant to calm a bride who was supposed to need calming. She didn't need it. She needed information, and nobody on that plateau was offering any. Lord Vale. The king's voice, when it came, was quieter than she'd expected from a man his size, pitched to carry without shouting. A word before the parties withdraw. Her father went to him. They stood 8 feet apart and spoke too low for her to hear, and she watched her father's shoulders the way she'd learned to watch them her whole life. The particular set that meant he was managing something, smoothing something, lying with his spine, even when his mouth told the truth. The king's face gave away nothing. But once, just once, his gaze flicked past her father's shoulder. Back to her. 2 seconds that time. She counted those 2. A woman approached her from the Thornhall side, older. Hair more silver than not, a long ropey scar across her throat that she wore the way some women wear a necklace, without apology, without explanation. "I'm Brenna," she said. "I keep the king's household. You'll ride with me. Will I be told anything?" Freya said, "Or is that not part of the arrangement?" Brenna's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "You'll be told what the king decides to tell you. That's more than most brides get for what it's worth." "It's worth knowing the rules," Freya said. "Even rules I don't like." Something shifted in Brenna's face. Not warmth exactly, but attention, the look of a woman revising a first impression. "He doesn't do that," she said low. "Look at someone like that." "Not since." She stopped herself. "Since what?" "Ask him yourself when he's fool enough to let you." Brenna turned toward the horses. "We ride within the hour. Eat something first. You'll need it." Freya looked back once before she climbed into the wagon. Her father was still talking to the king, hands moving now. The particular animation he used when he thought he was winning an argument. The king wasn't watching him anymore. He was watching the tree line again. The same spot he'd watched before the ceremony started, before he'd turned to look at her at all. She filed it away. Information asymmetry was the only weapon she'd ever been allowed to carry, and she intended to keep carrying it. The road to Thornhall ran 4 days through country that changed under her like weather, Ashvale's soft gray hills giving way to black pine, the air losing its wood smoke and wet wool smell and taking on something colder. Like stone before rain, she rode in a covered wagon with Brenna and 2 guards who didn't speak to her and didn't need to. Their silence had its own grammar, watchful, professional. The silence of men guarding something valuable rather than someone they cared about. On the second night, she heard them. Not words. The cadence of an argument carried low across a campfire. Her father's voice and another man's, a Thornhall captain she hadn't been introduced to. She lay still in the dark and listened the way she'd learned to listen her whole life, from doorways, from stairwells, from the spaces between conversations that weren't meant for her. "The king won't ask twice," the captain was saying. "If Vale's playing both ends of this, Vale's played both ends of everything for 30 years. Her father's voice too loud, too quick. "That's not new information." A long pause. Then, quieter. "It is if he's playing them against the king's own house." She didn't sleep that night. She lay with her wrist still faintly tender from the cord and thought about her father's hand on his ring. twice in one ceremony, and the king's eyes finding her face when nothing about the moment had called for it, and she understood, not the shape of it yet, only the size, that she had been handed over into something larger than a border dispute. Nobody had told her the truth of what she was for. She was beginning to suspect nobody intended to. Thornhall's keep sat on a ridge of black granite that the locals called the Spine, and it looked it. Long, vertebral, towers like raised hackles against a sky the color of a bruise just past its worst. Freya arrived on the fourth evening soaked through from a rain that had started an hour outside the gates and felt, absurdly, like a verdict. The wedding was set for 9 days out. Treaty weddings moved fast, before anyone's nerve or arithmetic could change. 9 days to learn a household, a husband, a kingdom that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and underneath the great hall's beams, the particular mineral tang of old stone that had absorbed 6 centuries of fires. She did not see Lucan again for 3 of those 9 days. This, too, she filed away. A king who looked at her like that on the plateau and then disappeared into his own keep without a word. That wasn't indifference. She was almost sure. Indifference didn't need to avoid a room. She started testing the theory the only way available to her, by being visible. Walking the upper gallery at the hour she'd learned, from a kitchen girl named Tilda, that the king reviewed his border reports. Standing where she could be seen without seeming to wait to be seen. On the 3rd day, it worked, and she almost wished it hadn't. He came around the gallery corner faster than she expected for a man his size, a folded map under one arm, and stopped 2 strides from running into her. Up close he was worse. Bigger, yes, but also more specific, the long pale scar on his forearm catching lamplight, a stillness in him that wasn't calm so much as held, like a door braced from the other side. Lady Vale, formal, distant. Exactly the tone she'd built herself to expect on the plateau and hadn't gotten. Your Majesty. She matched it. 2 could withhold. He didn't move past her, that was the tell. A king with somewhere to be doesn't stop to be looked at. You're walking the East Gallery at an unusual hour. I'm told the light's better here in the mornings. It is. A pause longer than the sentence needed. I'd heard you don't sleep well in the South Tower rooms. The wind through the old chimney flew. She hadn't told anyone that. She'd mentioned it once, in passing to Brenna, 3 nights ago, half asleep and irritated. You hear a great deal for a man I've barely spoken to. Something moved through his face. Not quite a smile, more the shadow a smile leaves when it decides not to land. I make it my business to know who sleeps badly in my house. Is that concern or strategy? Does it have to be only one? It was the first thing he'd said that sounded like a person and not a king, and she felt it land somewhere under her ribs, unwelcome, useless. She had 8 days left to become his wife, and she did not have room in the arithmetic of survival for liking him. You looked at me, she said before she could decide not to. On the plateau. Everyone saw it. Nobody's told me why. His jaw worked once. Would an answer help you? It would tell me what I'm worth to you. Cargo doesn't usually rate a second look. You're not cargo. It came out fast, almost sharp, and then he seemed to hear himself and pulled back from it, the map shifting under his arm. I have a council waiting, Lady Vale. He left before she could press it, and she stood in the East Gallery with the morning light he'd correctly predicted falling across the stone, and thought, that wasn't strategy. That was a man telling the truth faster than he meant to. It wasn't enough. But it was the first crack in 9 days of locked doors, and she held onto it the way she'd once held onto small cruelties from her sisters. Proof that something in the world was paying attention to her, even if she couldn't yet say why. That evening, Brenna found her in the tower room, mending a tear in her travel cloak with the small exact stitches her mother had taught all 4 daughters before she died. He doesn't usually stop for anyone, Brenna said without preamble, settling into the room's one chair. In the gallery. People learn to walk faster when they see him coming, not slower. Is that meant to reassure me? It's meant to tell you something's different. And you're smart enough, I shouldn't have to spell out what. Brenna's scar caught the firelight when she tilted her head. 6 years I've run this household. I've watched him sit through 100 negotiations with his face like a closed gate. I have never seen him do what he did on that plateau. Which was? Forget himself. Brenna stood, smoothing her skirts. He hates it. You should know that going in. He'll spend the next 8 days trying to put the gate back up. Don't mistake the trying for the truth. Freya turned the cloak over in her hands, found the next loose thread. And if I can't tell the difference? Then you're like every other bride who's walked into this, keep not knowing what she's standing in. Brenna paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think you can tell the difference. I think that's half of what unsettled him. She left and Freya sat alone with the fire and the mending and the slow, unwilling recognition that she had begun, against every rule she'd built herself by, to want to know this man. Not the king, the man who'd said, "You're not cargo," too fast to have planned it, and then run from the truth of his own sentence. 8 days. A wedding waiting at the end of them like a door she still couldn't see the far side of. She didn't know yet that the door had a lock built into it, and that her own father held the key. The 7th day broke the rhythm the gallery had set. Freya had learned the keep's grammar by then. Which corridors led to the kitchens, which stair was steepest. The particular hour Lucan crossed the east gallery, and she'd begun, despite every instinct telling her not to arrange her own mornings around it. Small collisions. A few traded sentences. Nothing that would survive being repeated at a treaty table. And everything that mattered more than the treaty table to her, which frightened her more than the wedding did. That morning he wasn't in the gallery. He was in the lower yard, sleeves pushed back, working a sparring drill against a man twice his bulk, with a focus that read like punishment rather than practice. She watched from the colonnade longer than she meant to. The scar on his forearm flexed white with each block. He fought like a man trying to outrun something in his own skull. "He does that," Brenna said, appearing at her shoulder, "when the council's been at him about something he doesn't want to say out loud. What's the council been at him about?" Brenna's silence had a shape to it. "Ask your father." It was the first time anyone in the keep had pointed her at Cassian Vale like he was a door worth opening, and the suggestion sat wrong in her stomach all morning. Sat wrong enough that she found him before midday. In the guest wing the Thornhall household had given him, going through correspondence with the particular efficiency of a man who didn't want to be interrupted. "You've barely spoken to me since the plateau," she said, closing the door behind her. He didn't look up. "There's been a great deal to arrange. Arrange with whom?" "I haven't seen you in council. I've seen you write 4 letters a day to riders who leave before dawn and don't carry Thornhall seals." That got his attention. His hand found the signet ring. 3rd time she'd watched him do it, and this time she counted the gesture for what it was. Not habit, but tell. "You're imagining conspiracies because you're frightened. That's natural for a bride." "I'm not frightened of the wedding," she said, and was startled to find it true as she said it. "I'm frightened of you. You've never once in 22 years arranged anything that cost you more than it cost one of us." His face did something old and tired, the look she remembered from her mother's funeral, grief worn like a garment that fit badly and had to be worn anyway. "Everything I've done," he said, "I've done for the house, for all of you. You don't understand the position Ashvale is in. Then explain it, for once, instead of touching your ring and telling me to be a good girl about it." He stood, finally, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer her. There was something raw moving behind his eyes, the look of a man 1 sentence from confession. Then it closed, the way it always closed, the way it had closed on every hard truth her whole childhood. "The wedding is in 2 days," he said. "Wear the blue, it suits you. Now I have letters to finish." She left without another word, because there was nothing left to say to a closed door, and walked the gallery with her hands shaking in a way she refused to let show in her face. "I'm frightened of you." She hadn't planned to say it. She hadn't known it was true until it left her mouth. She found Lucan an hour later, still in the yard, alone now, wrapping his knuckles with a strip of linen with the unhurried care of a man, buying himself time to think. "You fight like you're angry at someone who isn't in the yard," she said. He looked up, and something in his face was rawer than the gallery version of him, less guarded, sweat-damp hair pushed back from his forehead. "Lady Vale, you could call me Freya. We're to be married in 2 days. The formality seems wasted on us at this point." A breath that was almost a laugh, and not quite. Freya. Her name in his voice sat differently than she expected. Careful, like he was handling something he didn't want to drop. "What brings you to the yard?" "Your counsel's upsetting you, and my father's lying to me, and I'd like, for one conversation in this entire arrangement, to be told something true." She held his gaze, refused to let it slide the way it kept threatening to. "Even if it's not the truth I want." He wrapped the second hand slower than the first. When he finally spoke, it wasn't an answer, not the one she wanted. "There are things I can't tell you yet, not because I don't want to." His jaw tightened. "Because telling you puts you in a position I'm not ready to put you in. That's not an answer. That's a kindness shaped like one. It's the only kindness I have to give you right now." His eyes held hers, and for a moment the held stillness in him cracked enough that she saw what was underneath. Something that looked, unbearably, like fear, on a man who'd looked unafraid of everything else in the keep. 2 days, Freya. Give me 2 days before you decide I've lied to you." It wasn't enough. She told him so, with her silence, turning and walking back toward the tower before he could see what his use of her name had done to her composure. But she carried the fear in his face with her up every stair, turned it over the way she'd turned over her father's ring touch, his 2 fast letters, the riders without Thornhall seals. 2 days, a wedding, and underneath all of it, 2 men, her father and her husband-to-be, each keeping a truth from her that the other one already knew. That night, restless, she walked the lower corridor toward the kitchens for water and stopped outside her father's door, half open, lamplight spilling into the hall. He was speaking to someone she couldn't see, voice pitched low and urgent in a way she hadn't heard since her mother's last fever. The moment vows are spoken, the binding takes. He'll be vulnerable for the turning, exactly as we calculated. Ashvale's men move at first light the morning after. A second voice, older, gravelly, one she didn't recognize. "And the girl?" A pause, long enough that Freya stopped breathing to hear past it. "The girl," her father said, "was always the cost of doing it cleanly. She'll forgive me, or she won't. Either way, Ashvale rises out of Thornhall's ashes, and that's the only forgiveness that's mattered to this house in 30 years. The floor seemed to tilt under her. She backed away from the door before either voice could catch the sound of her. One hand pressed flat against the cold stone wall, her heart going so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She'll forgive me or she won't. She wasn't a bride. She had never been a bride. She was the latch on a door her father intended to walk an army through, and the man she'd started, God help her, started. To want had 2 days left before he found out the same way she just had. Too late to stop it, and from someone who should have told him first. The wedding dawned clear and cold, the kind of high mountain light that makes everything look more honest than it is. Freya stood in the blue her father had chosen. Of course it was the blue. He'd known exactly what he was dressing her in, a bride for a king he intended to gut, and let Brenna pin the last fold of fabric at her shoulder, with hands that had gone, sometime in the last hour, perfectly steady. Fear does that, past a certain point. It stops shaking you and starts sharpening you instead. "You've gone quiet," Brenna said, watching her in the mirror. "Quieter than yesterday. I heard something I wasn't meant to hear." Brenna's hand stilled at her shoulder. "Tell me." So she did, low, fast, every word of it, the binding that took at the vows, the turning he'd be vulnerable for, Ashvale's men moving at first light the morning after, her father's voice saying, "She'll forgive me, or she won't," like forgiveness was a coin he'd already decided he could afford to lose. Brenna's face went the color of the stone walls. The king doesn't know. I don't think he knows the shape of it. I think he suspects something. The letters, the council, the way he's been fighting in that yard like he's trying to hit a truth he can't catch. But not this. Not that my father built me as the latch on his own murder. Then we tell him. Now, before, and if my father has men already inside the walls. If telling him now is the trigger instead of the vows. Freya's hands found each other, twisted together hard enough to hurt. I don't know which wire is live, Brenna. I only know that the moment I open my mouth, I might be the one who pulls it. It was the truest fear she'd carried in 22 years of being handed places she hadn't chosen. And she said it out loud, for the first time in her life, to a woman she'd known 9 days. Because there was no one else left who hadn't already lied to her once. The hall was full when they walked her down it. Thornhall's wolves on one side, what remained of her father's delegation on the other, and at the end of the aisle, Lucan, standing very straight in formal black, the pale scar on his forearm, visible where his sleeve had been cut to show it, an old Thornhall custom she hadn't understood until Brenna explained it that morning. A king bears the wound he survived, to prove to his bride what kind of man she's binding herself to. He'd survived something once. She was about to find out if he'd survive this. She walked toward him with her father's words sitting in her chest like swallowed iron, watching Lucan's face for any sign he already knew. Finding none. Only that same held stillness, and underneath it, when their eyes finally met across the last 6 feet of aisle, something that looked almost like relief, like a man who'd been holding his breath for 9 days and had just let half of it go. He didn't know. She was certain of it now, watching his face. Whatever he'd suspected, he hadn't suspected this. The priest began the binding words. Old words. The kind that had married wolves to mates and kings to treaties for 6 centuries, and Freya stood in front of Lucan with her hand in his palm warm, rough at the knuckles where the linen wrap had been that morning, steady in a way her own pulse wasn't, and understood that she had perhaps 30 seconds left before the vow took, and the trap her father had built around it sprang shut on a man she had, somewhere in 9 impossible days, started to love. The priest reached the final line. "Do you, Freya of House Vale, take this man's—" Wait, her own voice. It came out steadier than she felt, cutting clean through the hall, and every head turned, and her father's hand went to his ring so fast it was almost a flinch. "Freya." Lucan's voice, low, urgent, his hand tightening on hers. "There's a second army," she said, loud enough to carry, fast enough to outrun her own fear of being wrong about the timing. "Ashvale men, inside or near your walls, moving at first light tomorrow. The vow was never meant to bind me to you. It was meant to leave you open at the moment you trusted me most." The hall didn't gasp. It went silent in the specific, total way a room goes silent right before violence, and in that silence, she watched her father's face go through 3 things in under 2 seconds. Shock that she knew, fury that she'd said it, and then, worse than either, a kind of resigned, exhausted relief, the face of a man who'd been carrying a weight so long that even having it taken from him by betrayal felt like rest. "Guards," Lucan said, and his voice had changed entirely. Not louder, but lower, a register she hadn't heard from him, yet, the voice, underneath the careful gallery king. "Seal the hall. No one leaves who isn't already sworn to this house." Chaos took the next 90 seconds in pieces, too fast for her to track whole. Thornhall wolves moving to the doors, her father's captain reaching for something at his belt, and 3 Thornhall men closing on him before the motion finished. Her father himself not moving at all, standing very still in the center of the wreckage of his own plan, like a man who'd known, somewhere underneath the scheming, that this was always how it would end. Lucan hadn't let go of her hand. "Is it true?" he said. quiet just for her, while the hall reorganized itself around them into something more dangerous and more honest than a wedding. All of it. I heard it through your father's door, my father's door, 2 nights ago. I didn't know how to tell you without knowing what I'd be triggering. You told me anyway, at the only moment it mattered. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, an absent gesture. The kind a man makes when his hands need somewhere to put what his voice can't yet say. You could have let the vow finish. You'd have been queen either way, and safe either way, whatever came after. I didn't want to be queen that way. It came out simpler than she expected, simpler than 9 days of fear and arithmetic had any right to leave her. I wanted. She stopped. Aware of how many people were close enough to hear, aware that her father was 12 feet away under guard and listening to every word. Say it, Lucan said. Whatever it is. I'd rather have it now than guess at it for the rest of my life. I wanted you to choose me knowing the truth, she said. Not the version my father built, not cargo with a treaty attached. Me. Something moved through his face that she hadn't seen in 9 days of careful gallery distance. Not relief, not even tenderness yet, but something rawer, the look of a man watching a door he'd kept braced shut finally give way on its own terms instead of being broken down. I looked at you on that plateau, he said, because for 4 seconds you were the only honest thing in the entire ceremony. Everyone else was performing peace. You were just standing there, bracing for the version of this that hurt you least. His hand tightened around hers. I've been trying to put that gallery king face back on for 9 days, because I didn't think I was allowed to want something my own council was using as a weapon. I was wrong. I'm done being wrong about it. Behind them, her father's voice, finally, not defiant, not even afraid anymore, just tired in a way she'd never heard from him in 22 years. Freya. She turned. He looked smaller in the center of his own captured men than he ever had at the head of their family table. I did it for Ashvale, he said. Everything. Your sisters, the treaties, this. I told myself the house mattered more than any one of you, and I built that into a faith I never questioned, and I see now. His voice caught, an old man's catch, not performance. The real thing arriving too late to do anyone any good. I see now I built a faith that cost me every daughter I had to spend, and I never once asked if the cost was worth carrying. You didn't ask me, she said. Not once. Not on the plateau, not in your study 2 days ago when I gave you the chance. You had 100 moments to tell me the truth, and you chose the ring on your finger instead, every time. He didn't argue it. That, more than anything, told her how completely the scheme had already collapsed in him. A man who'd spent 30 years defending his choices had nothing left to defend this one with. Lucan's grip on her hand hadn't loosened. Your father will answer to Thornhall Law for what was planned here, he said to her. Quiet enough that it felt like it was only for her even with the halls still listening. That's mine to carry out. What happens between you and him after? That's yours. I won't make that choice for you, the way he made choices for you your whole life. It was, she understood, the single most respectful thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived in chains on a windswept plateau 9 days ago. Not a king deciding her grief for her. A man leaving the door open and trusting her to walk through it on her own feet. Finish it, she said, looking back at the priest, who stood frozen mid-vow with the particular helplessness of a man who'd never once in his career had a wedding interrupted by a foiled invasion. The binding. I want to finish it. Lucan's eyes found hers, searching, and she understood the question he wasn't asking out loud. Are you sure, after everything you just learned about what this vow was built to do? Not for the treaty, she said, not for either of our fathers. For the 4 seconds on the plateau when you looked at me like I was a person instead of cargo, and for 9 days of you trying to be honest with me, even when honesty cost you something. I want to finish it because I choose it, not because I was handed to it. The priest, recovering himself, found the final line of the binding words, voice shaking only slightly. Do you, Freya of House Vale, take this man, in body and bond, before pack and pack? I do, she said, before he'd finished asking, and the hall, wolves who'd been half a breath from drawing blood 30 seconds earlier, went still in an entirely different way. The stillness of people watching something true happen in the wreckage of something false. They didn't crown her that day. The chaos of arrests and confessions and the long, grim work of unwinding her father's plan took the hours a wedding feast should have had, and nobody in the keep seemed to mind the trade. She found Lucan near midnight on the same colonnade, where she'd watched him fight a sparring partner like he was trying to outrun a truth he couldn't yet name. He'd changed out of the formal black. The scar on his forearm caught the torchlight, pale and straight, no longer hidden under a ceremonial cut sleeve. You never told me how you got that, she said. Another time. He turned to face her fully, and the held stillness she'd first read as distance on the plateau looked, now, like something else entirely. A man who'd spent his whole reign bracing for the next betrayal, finally letting his shoulders down because the one he'd feared most had already come and gone and left him standing. There's a great deal I haven't told you. I'd like the chance to, properly, without a treaty or an army timing the conversation. I'd like that too. She found his hand without quite deciding to, the same hand that had held hers through the binding words, and felt his fingers close around hers, slow, careful, like something he still wasn't sure he was allowed to keep. Brenna told me, the first day, that you don't usually look at anyone the way you looked at me. I asked you why on the gallery, and you ran from the question. I'm not running now. His thumb traced once across her knuckles, the same absent gesture from the hall, and this time she understood it for what it was. Not absence at all, but a man translating something he didn't yet have words for into the only language his hands knew how to speak. I looked at you because for 4 seconds, on a plateau built entirely out of performance, you were the realest thing I'd seen in years. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, fully. But I know I don't want to spend the rest of my reign pretending I didn't see it. Below them, in the yard, torches were being banked for the night, and somewhere past the keep walls the mountains held the last gray light of a day that had started with chains and ended with something neither of them had a clean word for. Yet. Not victory, not romance exactly. Something quieter and harder one than either. I was so certain, she said, standing on that plateau, that I'd come north to be ignored. Furniture with a name attached. I built my whole self around surviving that. And instead, you turned. She looked up at him, the torchlight catching the scar on his arm. The careful stillness in his face that she now knew wasn't distance, but the shape a guarded man's tenderness takes when he's not yet sure it's safe to let it show plainly. Everything changed the moment you turned. I don't think I understood until tonight that being handed over and being given up on were two different things. My father gave up on me the day he decided I was worth less than what I could buy him. You never did. Not once in 9 days, even when staying honest with me cost you ground in your own counsel. He didn't answer that with words. He lifted her hand, the one still wearing the gray-blue cord from the plateau, faded now, worn soft from 9 days of wear, and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Not the formal gesture of a king to a treaty bride, but something slower, something that lingered a half-second longer than ceremony required, his eyes never leaving her face while he did it. Somewhere below, a lone wolf call rose from the tree line beyond the spine, long and low, answered a moment later by another, and another, the keep's pack greeting a king who had, against every careful instinct that had kept him alive this long, let himself be seen wanting something. Freya stood on the colonnade in her wedding blue, the cord still soft around her wrist, and watched the man who'd looked at her like she was a person, not cargo, not a clause, not a latch built to spring a trap. Finally let the gallery king face fall away completely, leaving only the one underneath, uncertain, unguarded, and entirely hers, by no one's hand but her own choosing.